Hi everyone, my name is Daniela Paez. I would like to start by saying that the conservation of traditional sounds is essential for strengthening Ecuadorian cultural identity, and that in the composition of Andean Dream, there was a personal and collaborative process that could not have been realized without the help of Quechua music producer and multi-instrumentalist Jesus Bonilla, who recorded all the Andean musical materials. I will start with a brief history of Ecuadorian music, including the instruments relevant to the composition. For those of you who don't know, this is where Ecuador is located. There are traces of music in the ancient Andes that date back to around 4000 BCE. Instruments in the form of ocarinas, whistling bottles, pututos or conch shell replicas, rattles, and copper bells prove the importance that music has had throughout history in the Ecuadorian region. Andean instruments like pan flutes and pingullos, or high-pitched flutes, still used in the present, retain characteristics from these ancient instruments. Additionally, during the Spanish colony, European instruments permeated Andean tradition like the violin, harp, guitar, mandolin. I placed electronics and Andean Dream in the present, where the use of technology has allowed us to explore the sonorities of all the instruments previously mentioned. Mestizaje, or the racial and cultural mixture that derived from the colonization, has derived in a sense of confusion about what belongs to us and what does not. Musically, this has created different categories within Ecuadorian music, like indigenous, Afro, and mestizo Ecuadorian music. These are still broad categories, especially when referring to indigenous music, as there are 14 indigenous nations in Ecuador. I used two digital platforms for the creation of the electronics. These were Ableton Live and Max MSP and their interface, Max for Live. Parallel to the initial stages of the project, I became interested in dream symbolism, and I realized that electronics could be a great way to represent dreams understood as unconscious aspects of our mind. Electronics offer limitless possibilities that, for me, reflected the depths of the unconscious universe. The compositional process was centered around the use of these devices to create atmospheres, to develop motives, and to create randomly generated melodies that evoked the Ecuadorian sound. The device you see here corresponds to one that I named Capas, or Layers synth. This creates up to 7 layers of manipulated sounds with only one audio sample. I define my process as a compositional exploration of psychoethnomusicology due to the two elements that were determinant to the composition: Jungian archetypes and ethnomusicology. Within this project, an archetype is understood as a complex symbol that appears in stories from cultures around the world, embodying something universal in the human experience. The language of art is one of archetypes, ancestral memories expressed through symbols. In this sense, every creative project is a self-portrait, and through artistic expressions, we see ourselves. There is an Andean archetype essential for the conception of Andean philosophy. Understanding this concept will shed light on the ways in which ethnomusicology and archetypes were connected within this composition. Chacra is Quechua for piece of land or vegetable garden. Agriculture is central to the Andean Cosmo experience. Alfonso Cachimuel, Quechua author, proposes the term cosmo experience as opposed to cosmology or worldview, in the sense that the latter represent this observing of the cosmos, versus cosmo experience, which expresses living in time and in space, in dialogue with and as a part of the Andean micro and macrocosmos. In a circular manner, through the chakra, Earth provides for humans as humans care for the Earth. Chakra means more than just vegetable garden. It has an inclusive meaning that connects everything: work and worship, the social and economic, ethics, experience, and cosmic coexistence. Music and dance are an essential part of the Andean rituals, expressing indigenous knowledge in its relation with nature. There is a direct connection between agriculture and music. The social function of music lies in the festive calendar, which is parallel to the agricultural year. In the Andes, archetypes are subjacent to every dance or ritual in the contact established with nature through celebration, prayer, appreciation, and nurturing of Earth's force. I chose 3 archetypes to define the 3 movements of the piece. The first one is fire. The psychoanalytical meaning of archetypes is complex and deep, just as it is in the Andean cosmos. When I explained the idea of using archetypes to define the composition, Jesus connected the archetypes with different stages of the Andean agro-festive calendar in order to determine which instruments and melodies to record for each movement. In other words, he recorded the instruments that would typically be played during that specific time of year. Fire represents destruction. It is ominous, it is violent, but it also gives way to purification, new beginnings. It is parallel to death as the counterforce of life, without which life ceases to exist. I chose fire to represent the cultural mestizaje, which resembles new beginnings as a consequence of the violent colonial processes. The richness of Ecuadorian music not only survived the horrendous atrocities of the conquerors, but it continued to develop, adapt, and transform itself, appropriating European instruments into the pre-existing musical language of the Andes with connotations completely incomprehensible to the European culture. Fire was related to the Capac Raimi, which is the celebration of the preparation of the chakra carried out in the solstice of December. Capac means wise, and Raimi stands for festivity. Fire is used to eliminate residues from the land, preparing it for a new cycle. The rhythm we recorded here is the danzante, which is a slow dance in 6/8. It means dancer. We recorded it for Andean bass drum and pingullo, which is an end-blown duct flute. In this case with 3 holes, 2 in the front and 1 in the back. Traditionally, the pingullo is played on one hand, while the other hand plays a tambourine. The pre-Columbian musical materials used in fire correspond to the pututo and cascabeles. The pututo is a ceramic conch shell replica corresponding to the Pasto period of 700 to 1500 CE. This is how I represented this sound within the graphic score of my composition. The complex interconnected bartering tradition, or trading without the use of money, and the travel of the sea conch shells from the coast of Ecuador to the highlands gave way to the creation of pututos. You're going to hear this instrument. The other instrument that appears in fire are the cascabeles, or copper bells, corresponding to the Milagro Quevedo period of 500 to 1532 CE. This is how I represented them in the graphic score. Metalwork has been registered in Ecuador since 300 BCE. These instruments could be played or shook, or they might have been used as sounding bracelets or used on ankles and wrists. Amplifying sounds of the body with these instruments is still used within Latin American dance traditions. After I had finished the electronics for the piece, I decided to add parts for chamber ensemble consisting in flute or piccolo, violin, and cello. To write the parts, I created tone rows based on the pitches of the pingullo melody, which are B, D, E, and G, and wrote a part in klangfarben melody, which means tone color melody, and that corresponds to splitting the melody among diverse instruments to create a variation in timbre. You can see the score here. This is the electronics and the parts for chamber ensemble. fire is defined by the pingullo melody, developed through the use of my kappa synth and consequently the chamber trio fading out the melodic contents. I'm going to show you how the electronics of the pingullo sound. The next movement of the piece is water. Water is a giver of life, of feminine power. In the Quechua tradition, it is Yakumama, or water mother. It has cleansing and purifying qualities. Within psychoanalytical terms, water represents the unconscious. A surface of a body of water is that which we can see of our unconscious mind, metaphorically speaking. Perhaps if we dive into this ocean, we can grasp onto sections of its internal depth and bring them to the surface briefly, but it will never cease to be infinite. The unconscious is home to the archetypes, which also correspond to the images manifested in our dreams. Jesus related water with the Paucar Raimi. Paucar means blossoming, and so this is the celebration of the flowers in March. Within the composition, the depiction of this archetype also suggests a personal dive into the water, attempting to understand who I am as a composer in the universe of Ecuadorian music, and to portray how the study of Ecuadorian music delimits my search for self through the act of creating. We recorded two rhythms, the yumbo and chimbapura. Yumbo is a 6/8 dance with fast tempo. We recorded it for paya, which is this very small pan flute. It's pentatonic, and the largest of its reeds measures 7 inches, and the Andean bass drum, which you see here. The next rhythm that we recorded was the harp and Andean bass drum for chimbapura, which is also in 6/8 but allegretto. This is the Andean harp, which you see here. In the 18th century, many indigenous harpists emerged, learning to play by ear. In writings from 1777, a Jesuit priest mentions that in a town there might not be a tailor or a shoemaker, but there is always a harpist. Within the Andes, the harp has made its way into diverse festivities and ceremonies. One of the most iconic is the child wake ritual. I'm going to play the chimbapura and show you the score. Pre-Columbian materials that were used for water correspond to the sonajero or rattle from the Valdivia period of 3000 to 1000 BCE. A Venus is a stereotypical female archaeological representation that shows the life cycles of women. Pregnant Venuses are rattles that contain tiny ceramic spheres on the inside. I used the sonajero to create water sounds with my electronic devices. That was the original sample, and this is the water. This is the atmosphere that I created with the paya or pan flute recording. Finally, the third movement, mountain. Mountain was the most explicit archetype representing the Andes Mountains as geographically determinate of cultural process. The archetype of mountain denotes a search for wisdom, the journey, the climb. In the Quichua tradition, apus are grandparents, the elders, the wise. There are different aspects of the mountain, like its grandness, its height, the specific place where one is located, that all entail different symbolic meanings. In the combination of all these qualities, we can understand it as a whole. Within the composition, the mountains represent this place that connects us throughout history. If there is one thing that Andean mestizos like me share with all other Andean cultures, it is this geography. Even if we may not have grown up with the same traditions or worldviews, we are united by the places that have seen us grow and that have been our homes and the homes to our ancestors. In mountain, the theme is determined by pre-Columbian instruments instead of the Andean instruments that define the last two movements. Regardless, the mountain was connected to the Inti Raymi, which is the celebration of the sun, corresponding to a time of harvest in June. The pre-Columbian musical materials correspond to the ocarina and botella silbato or whistling bottle. The ocarina is an oval-shaped flute that has existed within the whole Ecuadorian region. And in this case, it corresponds to the Wangala period, 500 BCE to 500 CE. This is the whistling bottle. This corresponds to a sounding artifact as opposed to an instrument due to the function that it carries aside from making sound. This one is from the Chorrera period, 1000 to 300 BCE. The whistling bottles represented a technological revolution for pre-Columbian societies because water travels from one vessel to the other, pushing the air to produce a sound imitating those of the animals that are represented in the object, which in this case is an eagle. With the ocarina sample, I created a part with my electronics, and the ocarina in its layers created these dense harmonies. This is the sample that you will hear now, which I called Ocarina Collage. And for chamber ensemble, I took pitches from these harmonies, and the instruments play along with the ocarina collage, which corresponds to this 6-part phrase. Finally, This project has been a multifaceted, creative, and personal process. I took this experimental approach to composition that intentionally evokes symbolism through soundscapes, or in other words, by creating a sound depiction of the archetypes. This exploration is directly linked to my personal search for meaning through a reconnection with my musical roots. The use of electronics and chamber ensemble establishes a link between new music techniques and ancestral knowledge implicit in the pre-Columbian musical materials and the Andean. The circular processes that outline Andean traditions taught me about how we can relate our creativity through a practice of interconnection and exchange, of understanding our trade as something that nourishes us as we nurture it. Ultimately, the more aspects of our worlds that we can convey through our music, the deeper we can connect to it as composers, performers, or listeners. Thank you.